Bite-Sized Buyers, the podcast that brings you the latest in technology news from the unique perspective of global technology procurement experts. This week, you've got myself, Sam Harris.
And I'm Nick Wagstaff.
And this week, we're going to change things up a little bit. So rather than having multiple news stories to chat through, we're going to focus in and do a bit of a deeper dive on one, an issue that's becoming more prevalent at the moment. And that issue centers around the ongoing situation with Marks and Spencer's and the Co-op. So, without further ado, let's deep dive into it. Okay, so let's set the scene for the topic before we dive in. As we discussed a few times on the podcast already, there's the ongoing situation at Marks and Spencer's. Today, Wednesday the 21st, they confirmed that they're expecting the impacts to go on through into July. So it's still an ongoing situation. Co-op, there's less public news about, but obviously there's the situation at Co-op, and there was the attempted situation at Harrods.
Yeah, I think also allegedly Co-op literally pulled the plug. That was the story, wasn't it? They pulled the plugs out of things. Yep.
Yeah.
Old school.
Which seemed to give them a little bit of respite, but maybe not enough. And then over the weekend, there were reports that there were a growing number of attempts on US retailers as well, although not confirmed to be from the same group of actors, but believed to be similar in terms of the nature of the attack. Now, I think there's a couple of areas that would be really interesting to deep dive on, and the first of those that I want to get your view on, Nick, is around the impact that this will potentially have, both from a client perspective, so in this case Marks and Spencer's Co-op, but any other retailer, any other organization, but also then from the supplier perspective. So over the weekend, it was reported, I think by BBC first, that there was a confirmed third party who had access to systems at Marks and Spencer's who had allowed the attackers into the system in the first place. We're not here to speculate on who that is. It's quite widely being reported and discussed now, but we're not here to discuss them specifically, but more about the wider impact
the principles
on a supplier and on the wider market when these situations occur.
Yeah. So I think, it's a really interesting point, because I think if you think about how these third-party providers, what they operate on trust, right? So it's that, am I gonna trust you to run my operation? Am I gonna trust you to run that part of my business, to host this, to develop this, whatever that might be? And trust is very easily lost and very hard to win.
Agreed.
So I think there's a real potential issue here where and it could have a knock-on effect to all of the industry, which is, well, if it's happened to them and it's come through a third party, how am I protected? How am I going to make sure it's not going to happen to me? So what we're probably going to see a lot of scrambling around of, look, this will happen to you with us because of X, Y, Z. But I think there's a view then in terms of, well, making sure that your own systems and, well, there's a couple of parts to this. I think, well, there's maybe three actually, we're like working threes. But the first one is, it's that thing of, what have we got in terms of protection from a contractual perspective? We love contracts, we're procurement people, what have you got in place? What's the worst case scenario? All of those things. And then there's that element of what are they doing, and what level of due diligence are you doing on their systems to make sure that you're comfortable with it? And then I think the third one, I think you've talked about this before, Sam, in terms of, be careful about what you're gonna give to third parties. What are your crown jewels? What are the things that you need to keep in-house? You don't necessarily need to, we've seen this big sort of transition or more recent trend of being more hybrid, whether it's hybrid cloud or hybrid operations. So what are you going to do then to sort of say, what are you going to protect? Are we going to see a bit of a scaling back of this? We're seeing a bit of a trend over here in the US as well, where they're they're insourcing a lot of work as well.
Yeah,
So we see it's
I
like
think
everything's cyclical, isn't it? But
it is. And then just on the first point, hold that thought on contract, because that's the second part that I want us to deep dive into
yeah,
after this. But it's a really, really important point in terms of protections. In terms of, I think the key thing for me here is, in this industry, and just for context or additional context here, the alleged or now reported way in which access was gained by these individuals or this group was to go via a service desk in
yeah,
effect and get the credentials changed of employees within the organization.
yeah.
We believe potentially through social engineering to mimic and imitate
Yeah, they're
the
very good.
individuals in
Yeah,
question.
yeah,
And then obviously once they're in, they were then able to do the damage that they've done, and that is
yeah,
continuing to be felt. Now, in terms of that piece itself, I know you made a really important point there, I think, around what you do and don't outsource. Now, service desk has long been a classic area for decades now,
yeah,
which has been
yeah.
outsourced, and partly because a lot of the organizations in the space do a really good job at it, because
Absolutely.
they do it
Yeah,
more than any
yeah,
other sort of client naturally would, because they
yeah.
do it for
They're
several
much
other
better. Yeah,
organizations. Um, Now, the one thing that I'm concerned about here from a wider, just to elevate up a little bit back for a second to the macro view from a market perspective, the thing I'm concerned about here is these organizations for a long time have been positioning themselves as thought leaders in the space. And to your point around trust, it takes a moment to destroy trust and a
yeah,
lifetime to build it.
yeah,
And normally it's the other way around. It takes you most of the lifetime to build it. Once you finally get there, if you destroy it, there's no coming back.
yeah,
And my concern here is that I think, and potentially unfairly in some circumstances, there's going to be a lot of blame placed on these organizations because of the route in. Now, in reality, would any organization who runs their own service desk be any better protected from social engineering attacks? No.
no,
The reason that you'd go via someone like one of these large service providers is because of the treasure trove at the end of it. We ought to
yeah. It's
remember,
the
this is
reach, isn't it? Yeah,
ransomware.
yeah,
This is for money.
yeah,
This isn't for fun and games, really.
yeah,
So you're going to go for the biggest prize. So I don't think necessarily. I think people, we got to be careful in glass houses not to be throwing too many stones at
yeah,
others. But naturally, there are going to be questions asked, and there should be questions asked, and there needs to be additional scrutiny placed on all elements of the process.
yeah.
You know,
Well, if you think
it,
about it, I mean, these the attackers, even for want of a better term, they always look for the sort of the opportunity, don't they? They're looking for the vulnerable part that they can go through, and it's quite a clever approach to say, right, okay, let's go through this route, get it reset, and we're in now. So I think it's probably there's a bit of a, I mean, we're constantly having wake up calls, aren't we, in the tech world in terms of attacks and that type of thing. But it's how do you sort of change that or improve your capabilities so you're not as vulnerable, you're not as exposed, and they're all going to be doing it now. Everybody's going to be doing it, and everybody should be doing it. Quite right to say, how do we do that? And I think back to some of the other big attacks. I think it was SolarWinds, which was one a few years ago.
yeah,
It was a real backdoor thing. It was something that sort of was
yeah.
it
But
was really hidden, and they're absolutely they're
but then
geniuses. Some of these people.
there's another issue here, isn't there? And I think the age of AI actually might stop it from happening in this way this time. Look back at those major attacks. In the immediate aftermath, everybody promised that they'd learn. Oh, we're going to do things
Yeah,
differently. We're not going to be victim of the same fate. Fast forward,
yeah,
and they are, because people ultimately, when pushers come to shove, haven't invested appropriately often in cybersecurity and don't have that level of maturity in that space. Now, look, you can't defend for every, or you can't prepare for every situation. All you can do is
yeah,
be as prepared as possible for when it does happen. That you got the protocols in place. That ideally isn't just turning everything off and unplugging everything,
yeah,
but that actually helps to repel the attacks. Now, it would appear, for example, that Harrod were able to do so. We don't know exactly, obviously, what stage that attack got to before it was shut down, but they didn't have the same success there. So there are lessons to be learned here, and I think rather than the finger pointing, which is a natural part, it's part of
yeah,
human nature as well,
yeah.
isn't it? But rather than the finger pointing here, it should be, to your point, lessons learned. It should be coming together and saying how are we collectively better and how do we do better to stop this from happening going forwards.
Yeah.
And I think one of the key parts of that, to your point before, to move us on slightly, is on the contracts. And just really briefly from my perspective here, in terms of what, and I'm sure you've got a similar but also potentially different view as well. It's very rare that we find contracts that are either appropriately drafted to contain the relevant protections, or when there are, relevant plans in place, or there are clauses in the contract that require certain processes to be defined, they're not followed up on.
Yeah.
So in the procurement process, you say, right, we want a disaster recovery plan, we want business continuity plans, we want all this great stuff, and within 6 months you must present it back to us.
Yeah.
Then you say, okay, the contract was signed 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Have you checked it?
Yeah.
Oh no, didn't realize that I needed to do that.
And equally, I think you think of some of these relationships. They're multi-year relationships. Some of these things have been in place. They're working on. We see things where they're working on terms from 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think there's a responsibility, I think, from a procurement perspective and an SRM, supply relationship management perspective, that says, well, look, it's not just about how they're operating. Do we need to refresh the terms? Do we need to refresh the agreements? And I think that's probably something we need to do more of and be better at. To
We,
say, look, this has
yeah.
changed. This is not it's not an opportunity to sort of beat anybody up, but it's about sort of protecting and saying, right, what are you doing to change these things? How can we amend the contract to do it and make it not overly onerous? Make it, as a real sort of way of being collaborative. But that's got to work as well.
Look, 100%. I think, but I think as well here, this is right. So one of the key issues we have as procurement professionals often is that, especially in the technology arena, where there's agile ways of working in place, this sort of fast paced, iterative, things can change. Procurement is often seen as being very rigid and a blocker in the process because it's long and it takes a long period of time, and we need it now, and that can create that conflict between technology stakeholders and procurement. And it's situations like this where a contract is a cumbersome, and an RFP and all the rest of it is a cumbersome process, and it's annoying and it's getting in your way until you're relying on the wording of that contract.
Yeah.
Because your system has been attacked and you've gone dark, and your customers can't access your website, and you can't sell anything, and you can't deliver your goods around the country or around the world. And I think this again, it should be a wake up call. You're right, to procurement professionals in terms of making sure that things are updated and that are relevant for today, but also for tech stakeholders and wider stakeholders. I'm using tech here because of what we're discussing, but it should be a wake up call for those stakeholders to realize that actually it is an incredibly important process, and it's incredibly important that they take it seriously and they know what's in the contract.
Yep.
Don't just rely on the procurement person to put it in place.
Yeah, it's living and breathing it, isn't it?
Yeah. The procurement person's there to be professional in buying you that service or that product, right? And doing the best job at doing so and putting the best commercial terms in place. They aren't there to be the leading expert in technology itself or the architecture of.
Yeah.
And that's where we need that input and expertise of the stakeholder.
Yeah.
And that combination, actually, if you can bring that together, so rather than being seen as kind of two opposing forces in that process, you bring that together, everyone benefits in the organization.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I think as well, there's that thing of we tend to deprioritize supply relationship management, and it's a really, really massively important part of sort of managing that relationship. That's what it's about, isn't it? And having those things in place, having the sort of the regular cadence of meetings and reporting, that's great. But you need to have that relationship where you're sort of saying, look, how are we going to deal with these things? How are we going to? You don't really want, if you're under attack, you don't want to be sort of getting out the contract going, right, we're going to point fingers. You want it fixing, don't you? But equally, you need a mechanism that says, right, how do we deal with this? And I think we see it a lot where supply relationship management is under resourced in a lot of clients and customers. It's not taken as seriously as it should be. It might be left as a side job for people. It's part of their role rather than it being front and center. So I think there's there's a potential element there where we might see a bit of a shift of a bit more investment in that type of thing as well.
Yeah, because I think even where we have seen it in place, quite often it'll be under the badge of a vendor management function,
Yep.
um, and it'll be defined as operational contract management, not commercial contract management, but operational contract management.
Yep.
But normally in those teams, the focus is on what's the active work we've got going on, how's that being delivered, how's that going. That's fine, right? That and that needs to be done. That's the performance management layer. But that's one basic layer, right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
one
That's the
one
easy
level
stuff in it.
of what's
Yeah.
going on here, and I think it's as well, actually, and I won't dive down this rabbit hole now, but just to mention, I think it's the same thing for innovation when it comes to SRM, in
Yeah.
that because you're so focused on the here and now and the today, there's not enough focus on the tomorrow, both from a how do we get better
Yeah.
and how do we make sure that we are protected in these kind of situations. To your point, if you're relying on wording that says that a supplier is liable if they are the sole party responsible for, well, obviously, you end up in an argument in court around
Yeah, yeah.
if they were
Yeah.
the sole person responsible, and
Yeah.
it's always vague enough. You're always in a losing battle if fundamentally you come down to arguing over the wording of a clause.
Yeah. Well, it's an
Um,
interesting thing. It's that thing that, we all get sold the dream, but you want to live the dream, don't you? That's the thing. You've got to be able to live it, and it's got to
yeah,
be realistic. Whether that is protection, whether it's innovation, whatever it might be, that says, right, you know what? And they're the best relationships. Those ones that are, they've got that transparency. You know exactly what you're doing. You know exactly what you're getting. You know exactly who's responsible. They've got all of those components that say, right, I know what's going to happen. I know what I need to do,
yeah.
and you work together to fix it rather than, to your point, we don't want to be pointing fingers, but it is a natural thing to do. But actually, you want to be saying, right, how do we fix this?
Yeah, it's a version of like advanced insurance, and
Yeah,
you wouldn't sit with you wouldn't buy your house and not insure it.
yeah,
You make sure that the protections are in place. You make sure that there were plans there. So you knew it's another way of looking at it that
yeah,
and I'm not saying it's just anyone puts this as a formal insurance in the contract, and I'm not talking about the insurances the likes of M&S have had in place, the cyber insurance. Um, it's more like business continuity insurance. It's more making
yeah,
sure that
yeah.
everyone's lined up and everyone's on the same
But it's
page.
it's working as a partnership in it. That I know it's a term that gets bandied around a lot, but this is where you'll see that true partnership coming to the fore.
It is, but then question then going back to the first part of this debate around the impact on the wider market reputation. We both spoke about trust and how this could destroy trust. And an event like this, is large enough to destroy trust between organisations, sometimes even for some organisations with a wider market, because
Yeah.
they'll sort of blanket everybody on tar everyone with that same brush. So if we talk about partnership here and the need for partnership, are you therefore saying that it's unfair for organizers for that trust to be lost? That actually people should step back for a second and consider the wider
Totally, yeah. I think
picture.
it's got to be that thing of, because if you outsource your services, you can't just sort of say, right, okay, well, it's your fault, and you've got to fix. Absolutely, they've got to do that, but you've got to fix it together. You've got to sort of be in that position where you're going, right, what happened? How did it, how did this happen? How do we fix it, and what do we put in place to make sure the risk of it happening again is minimal? There's always going to be that threat. It's always going to happen, but that's that key of, rather than going, right, it's their fault, let's get rid of them at quickest opportunity. It's saying, right, how do we sort of build this so we're more resilient in the future? That's got to be the key. It's just too easy to sort of, well, it's probably not that easy to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but you don't want to be in that position. You want to be saying, right, how do we fix this?
Yeah, just one build I'd add to that as well is consider how the wider market will will take how you act in this moment and how attractive you are as a client to them moving forwards. We know how competitive the market is, right? And we know how they all love taking logos off each other, and
Yeah,
they'll
yeah,
sometimes have fantastic deals to do so. But I spoke off the record, obviously, but I spoke to a number of people in the industry over the weekend and earlier this week, um, to get their views, both from the organisation, but also from the wider market as well. and not one of them was prepared to say a bad word about them. Now, obviously, I'm not, because off the record, I'm not going into detailed conversations,
Yeah.
but even in that private moment, not one of those suppliers was prepared to say, "Oh yeah, it's them, it's their
Yep.
fault,"
Yep.
because ultimately they know that actually there's a lot of different factors that play into
Yep.
this.
And they know it
So
could happen to them. That's the other thing as
it
well.
well,
You know.
it could, Nick, it could, but I think
Yeah.
also for them, if they see it, and M&S haven't done this, I'm not accusing them of doing so, but let's say that another organisation fell into the same situation and they came out straight away and said it was them, it was
Yeah.
supplier A, they've let them in, it's all their fault. That's it. We're terminating the contract for material breach. We're done with it.
Yeah.
And that might be the strong message they think that the shareholders want with the company. But that's going to destroy you in the marketplace. You then try and let that contract out again. Everyone's going to go, if you want us to do it, there's a risk premium, mate, and your price has just doubled.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's going to be an interesting. We're going to see. I think it'll be interesting to see what the fallout of this is going to be over the next sort of 3, 6, 12 months, and what
Yeah.
impact it has. I think we're going to see a focus on resilience in terms of services. So that's absolutely going to happen. And it's probably going to become more prevalent in the work that we do in terms of, RFPs, engaging with suppliers. CIOs are going to be so, and CISOs are going to be saying, this has got to get up. It's got to have a higher weighting. It's got to get up on the agenda. It's more and more important, and I think that's absolutely going to ring true.
And potentially, a tough time for the market with a combination of what's going on politically in the US, as we've debated many
Yeah.
times before,
Yeah.
and this. It's a tough spot the market finds itself in right now. Okay, so that concludes another episode of Bite Sized Buyers. If you've made it this far, then thank you very much as always for listening. Please do let us know what you thought about the slightly different format in the comment section down below. And also give us a thumbs up if you did enjoy it. If you didn't, don't give us a thumbs down. Just move on. Thank you. We'll be back as always at the same time next week. I've been Sam Harris.
And I've been Nick Wagstaff.
Until next time.